Welcome to Women and Resistance, a powerful podcast where we honor the courage, resilience, and revolutionary spirits of women across the globe. Hosted by Aya Fubara Eneli Esquire and Adesoji Iginla, we uncover untold stories of defiance against systemic oppression, whether colonialism, racism, sexism, or economic injustice. From historic icons like Winnie Mandela and Fannie Lou Hamer to today's trailblazers, we shine a light upon those shaping a more just world. This is a call to honor the past, embrace the present, and build an empowered future.
These two young women took ill and ended up at the hospital, and I was then accused of poisoning them. It was said that I poisoned them with a substance then known as Spanish. They chose Spanish fly because although it was very hard to get, it was also a substance that would be hard to detect within the bloodstream. Now, at no time was there any analysis of their blood, but because they got ill and I didn't, I was accused of attempted murder. I was arrested, I was charged, and a local mob took delight in using my predicament as proof that the Oberlin experiment was indeed a flawed and failed one and should be discontinued. I was fortunate enough to be represented by abolitionist lawyer.
Okay, welcome, and greetings to another episode of Women and Resistance. I am your host, Adesoji Iginla, and with me, before she goes into character, is Aya Fubara Eneli Esquire. And how are you, sister? Okay, today we are, traversing the life and times of Edmonia Lewis. Who is Edmonia Lewis, you might ask? We should find out in the course of our conversation with Miss Lewis in the next 1 hour or so. So, Miss Lewis, welcome to Women and Resistance.
Thank you.
It's a honor. And for those who might not have heard of you, could you just give us a quick rundown of how you came to enter our consciousness?
Quick rundown.
Yes, please.
How does one give a quick rundown of an entire lifetime?
Good question.
Well, first, where are my manners? I must thank you for the opportunity to be in conversation with you today. And I want to thank all of your audience, although this is a weird medium because I can't see them. But I've been assured that they are here indeed.
Yes.
And it would be great not just to have this discussion with you, but even to hear from them as well. Where do I begin? Well, let's start with my name. I was named Mary Edmonia Lewis, but I also had another name. And that name was from my mother's people, the Ojibwe. And that name was Wildfire.
Okay.
I was born 1844 near Greenbush, now Rensselaer, New York. And I was born to my mother, Catherine Mike Lewis, who was of Ojibwe and African-American descent. And my mother was known as a skilled weaver and an excellent craftswoman. There are different versions of who people believe my father to have been. According to one version, my father was Samuel Lewis, an Afro-Haitian man who worked as a gentleman's servant, and others say that my father was Robert Benjamin Lewis, who was a black writer. He was a black writer and a lecturer. Whatever version you go with, I am of the Native Americans, the indigenous peoples of the Americas, and I am also of African heritage.
Okay, interesting.
And I wonder if that is one of the reasons you chose for me to come and speak with you today
In light of
on the eve of, well, that the government term and what most people have come to embrace it as is Thanksgiving. But I assure you that for those of us who are Indigenous Americans, who are the Native Americans as we're called, from all nations, we were nations before we were stripped of our land and colonized. We would call it a day of mourning, wouldn't you?
Yeah. Rightly so.
Now, my birth date is listed as July 4th. I should note this. Back in that time, there were many Black people who chose July 4th as their birth date because these dates weren't necessarily recorded, the actual day of your birth. But July 4th being Independence Day of the United States of America, we, perhaps in the hopes that America would live up to
Its promise.
its written ideals of all of us being created equal, that would be a day that would mark our rebirth, if you will, in this now United States of America. If they say it was July 4th, I quibble with nobody. It's not relevant, but I did want to at least inform people of how some of these dates got chosen.
Okay.
There was definitely very much an idea of attaching to yourself to names and dates of significance. And so you see so many Black people with Washington or Jefferson wanting to be tied to the presidencies in some way, speaking power, that hope of what might become.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, for me, both my parents died when I was rather young, and I and my older half-brother, Samuel, went to live with our maternal relatives near Niagara Falls.
Okay.
We lived with our Ojibwe kin, and they sold arts and crafts. They sold homemade items, moccasins, things of that nature, similar to what my mother had also made. They sold them to tourists. There's always, certainly in my time, you can let me know if it is true for your time, this fascination with the very peoples that you are oppressing, where they are objectified.
Yeah. The naming of sporting.
And the fascination with everything that we have and are without ascribing to us our humanity. So there was a market for the things that the Native peoples made and used in their daily lives, but then we're now objectified just as artifacts, things to collect. I remember as a young child roaming the forests with my mother's people, with my people, and selling my own small crafts. They would tell me, my aunts would tell me that I was just like my mother. I was very good with my hands. As I eventually made a name for myself, I suppose today your generation will call it branding. I would say that I was cognizant of a need to, well, not a need, cognizant of the benefits that could accrue to help me with my work as a sculptor, which is what I became, and I will tell you that story shortly.
Okay.
But I was aware of how a certain mystique or embracing a certain narrative that appealed to my would-be benefactors and sponsors and clients could assist me in my work. And so this origin story of living with the Ojibwe, and at one time even she was born in a wigwam, and look at where she is now, was part of the allure. Obviously, being of both Native American and African heritage resulted in certain physical features of mine that also lent itself to this sense of exoticism. And later, when I would move to London, and I'm getting ahead of myself here, I actually listed my place of birth as India. And it was believable to them because
of the look.
take a look at our darker-skinned Indian friends and family across the globe, and there was not that much difference in how we looked. And so I suppose as a child, I was content with the life that I had, living with my people, living off the land, selling the items as we made them. But my brother, Samuel, who had left and had found he had made a fortune of sorts in the gold mines of California, he sent for me. He wanted a different life for me. He wanted more opportunities for me. And he wanted me to get educated. And so my brother provided the crucial financial support for my schooling. He allowed me to study at secondary and at college level institutions that would otherwise have been
Out of reach.
definitely inaccessible. I think it's important, I know it's important for you and your listeners to not just hear my words, but to remember the time in which I was born. What was happening across the United States of America in 1844? What was the fate of the Native peoples at that time? And what were they dealing with? What was the fate of African Americans at that time? Of course, we didn't use the term African Americans.
Yeah.
We were Negroes, we were niggers, and sometimes colored people. So this was well before the Civil War, as I hope your audience knows.
Huh?
Well, my brother eventually sent me to Oberlin College. This was one of the most progressive tertiary institutions of the time, because not only did they admit women, they admitted people of color, which was strictly unheard of across the vast lands of the United States of America. Now, Oberlin College was located in Oberlin, Ohio, and there were a lot of well-to-do Black families there. Middle class, teachers, pastors, people who worked jobs that allowed them to make a fairly decent living. And some of the colored students who would attend Oberlin would live with some of those more affluent Black families. There was a sense of community where people would take in other people's children of the same race just because they wanted to be part of elevating the race. Of course, we at that time did not really have the opportunity to mingle in certain ways with the white students. And then, of course, there was this strict line as well between the male students and the female students. And so the female students were enrolled in curricula that pertained to being a woman, the young ladies course. We did not learn Latin and some of the higher mathematics classes because I suppose there was a concern of our brains may combust because that was entirely too much mental work for genteel women. I ended up boarding with an abolitionist trustee. He was a white man and his family, Reverend John Keep. Oberlin definitely styled itself as a progressive experiment. And while there was some support for the experiment, there were many in the town who were also very upset at the notion of colored children and white children mingling and being taught in the same institution. And so we colored students faced a great deal of racism. And then we colored students who were women were doubly impacted because we faced not just racism, but also sexism. Well, back then, women were not supposed to fraternize or socialize without chaperones. I had an opportunity to socialize with two white classmates, Maria Miles and Christina Ennis. I should say that I went to Oberlin College in 1959. I was I was 15 years old when I went off to college. And I had shared a mixture of wine and spices with these classmates at the Keeps home where I was staying.
Okay.
Well, these two young women took ill and ended up at the hospital. And I was then accused of poisoning them. It was said that I poisoned them with a substance then known as Spanish fly. And they chose Spanish fly because although it was very hard to get, it was also a substance that would be hard to detect within the bloodstream. Now, at no time was there any analysis of their blood or to find out exactly what could have caused their illness. But because they got ill and I didn't, I was accused of attempted murder. I was arrested, I was charged, and a local mob took delight in using my predicament as proof that the Oberlin experiment was indeed a flawed and failed one and should be discontinued. I was fortunate enough to be represented by abolitionist lawyer John Mercer Langston. He himself had attended Oberlin. He was an Oberlin alum who later became a major Black political figure. And he agreed to defend me. And after he did not call me to the stand, there were many people who testified against me, but he never called me to the stand. But he gave a 6-hour closing argument that largely hinged on the fact that there was no chemical analysis of the woman's stomach contents, and therefore there was no evidence to prove, certainly not beyond a reasonable doubt, that I had indeed poisoned them. And so the judge dismissed the charges for lack of evidence.
Okay. You are listening to Women and Resistance with Aya Fubara Eneli Esquire and Adesoji Iginla, where we honor the voices of women who have shaped history through courage and defiance. If you're finding these stories inspiring, take a moment to subscribe, share, and support this platform. Together, we amplify the voices that deserve to be heard. Now, back to the conversation.
At a later point, I am going to share with you my thoughts on what I call good spirits, because think about the time. This was right before the Civil War broke out. And even today, how often are people convicted with no evidence, with less evidence? And so I attribute good spirits to the fact that I got to live and continue as a free woman. But my legal victory did not protect me. Shortly after I returned to college and was allowed to continue with my studies, a white mob kidnapped me. They dragged me into a field and they beat me to a pulp and left me for dead. I may have neglected to tell you that I was always considered small of stature. People described me as tiny, petite in build, barely 5 feet tall. They described me as small and quiet, but with a determined spirit. And after facing the attack by this mob and being left for dead, when I did not return to where I lived with the Keeps, there was a search party sent out for me. And they did eventually find my beaten and mangled body clinging to life. Again, good spirits, and they nursed me back to health. I returned to Oberlin College, determined to get the degree that I set out to get it, still financially supported by my brother Samuel. And then a series of unfortunate events occurred. And you might ask, could it get worse? Attempted murder? Almost beaten to death? Yes, I was now accused of burglary and of stealing art supplies. Again, I was able to beat those charges and get legally cleared But the faculty overseeing the young women's program, the young women's course, decided that she would not let me enroll for my final term at Oberlin. And since I was not enrolled, I could not take my exams. So I left I was dismissed from the institution. I left the institution without my degree. As you no doubt have heard, your listeners have no doubt heard time and time again, as you have spoken with other women in your sessions of Women in Resistance, and I'm very proud to be in the company of the women that you have discussed so far. You will know that American institutions have this way of trying to rewrite history.
Very much so.
And so, in 2022, and you might want to know, well, when exactly did she die? And I will get to that. But put a pin in this. In 2022, Oberlin posthumously awarded me a Bachelor of Fine Arts, formally acknowledging my talent and the injustice I endured in 2022.
So what was happening in 2022 that they will award you? Oh, okay. Okay.
We were still coming off of the guilt of, I believe, George Floyd.
Correct, yes.
Who is now an ancestor on this side with me. And we were making promises, or should I say they were, and attempting to distance themselves, some institutions, from their history. I suppose to the extent that one might want to be vindicated by history, I should be grateful. But of what use is that degree to acknowledge my talent, the talent I proved time and time again? I don't need that degree for that purpose. Well, since Oberlin didn't work out, I went to Boston around 1864 to pursue art. I had seen a sculpture of Benjamin Franklin in Boston. And although I did not know the name of the art form, I thought I too can make a stone man. Today, there are all kinds of artwork, not quite in the manner that we did it, because I went into the neoclassical style. But this will be an example of a sculpture, right? Now, of course, they make casts and they can mass produce these things. But that wasn't quite the way it was. And you may recognize who this young man, who's also now an ancestor. That would be Martin Luther King Jr.
Yeah.
Upon arriving in Boston and deciding that I was going to be an artist, I needed to find someone I could learn under. I needed to be under the tutelage of an artist.
Of a mentor.
Abolitionist allies opened the first doors. Reverend and Mrs. Keep, who had assisted me in Oberlin and in whose home I had resided, sent letters. Henry Highland Garnett wrote letters of introduction to William Lloyd Garrison. And then William Lloyd Garrison connected me to Boston's Circle of Sculptors and Reformers. And again, understanding the times. So 1864, I'm 20 years old now, and the Civil War is still raging. And the abolitionists were always looking for representatives of the race of the oppressed that they could hold up as an example of what the race could be if given a chance. But finding a teacher was incredibly difficult for a number of reasons. The sculptors were male, I was female, and I was a Black and something else female at that. And how many female artists were there, let alone Black female artists at a commercial level? Of course, we know within the homes, women were artisans and made many things that the family relied on. But we just didn't get that same respect of our abilities. And certainly, we did not get the same opportunities. Finally, a brave sculptor named Edward Augustus Brackett agreed to take me under his wing. He was a sculptor of marble portrait busts, and his clients included Garrison, Charles Sumner, and others. And under his tutelage, I copied his sculptures in clay, and then he would critique my technique. Under his tutelage, I made my first tools, the tools that I would use for my trade. And under his tutelage, I sculpted and sold my very first commercial piece, which was a woman's hand. And back then, I sold it for $8, which would be the equivalent of about $120 or so today. I learned a great deal from Edward Augustus Brackett, but our relationship soon soured and I was on my way. I had many early patrons in those days and promoters. I was featured in quite a few of their abolitionist papers, held up as an example of what was possible with my race. For women in the abolitionists and literary circles, they became some of my biggest champions. People like Lydia Maria Child, who biographers had been able to go and find her letters and see, the things that she wrote about me. Elizabeth Peabody was another one of my benefactors. I believe today we still have the Peabody Awards.
Yeah, Peabody
Anna
Trust.
Quincy Waterston, Laura Curtis Bullard. And these women quite often also served as editors of the papers like the Independent, Christian Register, and Broken Fetter. These were all abolitionist papers, and they really helped me reach a national audience and secure commissions for my work. And one of the things I would do is I would sculpt famous abolitionists, and their families or other patrons would then purchase those sculptures. My breakthrough sculpture was a marble bust of Colonel Robert Shaw, Gould Shaw. And some of you may remember him because in the movie Glory, with that really handsome young man, Denzel Washington, he was played by Matthew Broderick. Matthew Broderick played Colonel Robert Gould Shaw in that movie Glory. And if you remember, he led the group of soldiers, including Black soldiers who initially were so poorly taken care of in terms of their equipment, shoes, things of that nature. And we know that that regiment, I believe, suffered about 42% death, 42% of their regiment.
Correct.
And he eventually also lost his life. He was the commander of the Black 54th Massachusetts Regiment. And some of you may have heard of them. And if you haven't, you definitely want to go and read up about them and remember them as you enjoy your feast tomorrow. Because whatever thanks people are giving for this country
was a debt of gratitude.
Was paid for with the blood of my people on both sides of my family. And some others as well. Well, I sculpted the bust of Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, and his family bought that bust, and they were incredibly proud to have a bust of this great abolitionist. I then made 100 plaster copies of that bust, and I sold them all. I sold out all 100 of them at a cost of $15 per bust, which was a significant income for a sculptor of that time, for a woman of that time, and most certainly for a Black and Native American woman of that. Those sales and the benevolence of some of my sponsors enabled me to make my way to Rome. Rome was the place where all real sculptors of marble went. That was the place for the artists. So somewhere between the end of the Civil War and 1860, and on my passport, and there's a picture of it in this little book written for young readers called Seen, True Stories of Marginalized Trailblazers. And this one is on me, but they're actually stories of other women as well. Not in this one, but in others. But this is what my passport looked like. That's a picture replica of what it looked like. And what it wrote under my description is, Edmonia Lewis is a Black girl sent by subscription to Italy, having displayed great talents as a sculptor. Was practically driven to Rome in order to pursue opportunities for my art and to find a social atmosphere where my color was not this albatross around my neck. Hope that your audience is able to appreciate and or not quite fitting into any world. 2 harrowing trials, one of which could have cost me my life, and then trying to make a living in a profession that was not just the purview of men, it was the purview of white men.
Yeah.
And there was this constant weight on my shoulders, the experience of always being objectified. Who am I? Do you see me? Which is why I appreciate this book, Seen. What do you see when you see me? I concluded that this United States of America, the so-called land of liberty, had no room for a colored and female sculptor, dependent again on the benevolence of some of my abolitionist friends to make introductions for me to make my way in Rome. Initially, I worked in a studio and in a space that was established by a sculptor called Hiram Powers. I eventually was able to rent my own studio near the Piazza Barberini, and this was the former workspace of Antonio Canova. And through a series of activities that my benefactors in the United States felt were frivolous and a waste of money and time, I was able to ingratiate myself into a community of expatriate women sculptors who were dubbed the White Marmorian Flock. Henry James gave them that title, but I would pay for music lessons. I took piano lessons. It was a great way to meet other people. I think today you all will call it networking.
Correct.
And I would also play badminton, which was a sport that genteel women were allowed to engage in at the time. And some of my sponsors from the United States felt that these were frivolous acts and a waste of their money. And you have to believe that with everything in me, I needed to be self-sufficient. I did not want to be beholden to anyone. I did not want to be used as an object, even for well-meaning abolitionists, who again could tout me as a representative of my race or make themselves feel better as the white savior of the Black or Native peoples. I think still today we have many well-meaning
white saviors.
This group that I joined of expatriate women sculptors is what has now lent some writers and scholars to speculate as to my sexuality and to draw inferences and make assumptions and conclusions that I must have been queer. There is nothing that I'm aware of that I have shared to give any credence to these assertions, but I suppose once you die, people can make of your life what they will.
Yeah.
Of course, we know that for many decades, my name was largely forgotten. Recent scholarship, to this effect will argue that the relative freedoms that white women sculptors found in Rome, the financial support, the queer partnership and what they call the bohemian life wasn't something that I was totally immersed in, because I still had to navigate this racial exoticism, that I was labeled with. And then also just this sense of tokenism, which is why in even many of these liberal spaces, you can have only one black darling at a time. We just need one token, not
True.
too many of you.
Yeah. Let's to get comfortable.
Another charge against women sculptors at the time to diminish who we were as artists was this idea that we hired men to do most of our chiseling and our sculpting because we just did not have the physical ability to do so, that we could not execute our own designs, and so we hired stone carvers. And so to that extent, I insisted on carving my own marble, fearing that given not just my gender, but also my race, that for sure authorship of any of my pieces would be doubted if in any way anyone else had assisted me. That meant a lot of work on my part. So, for instance, one of my best known works, The Death of Cleopatra, actually took me over 4 years to complete. The Smithsonian today notes that I did my own stonework out of fear that if I didn't, my work would not be accepted as original. Again, although I speak of it rather impassionately, to put yourself in the shoes of a young woman, orphan, traveling the world alone, trying to make a name in spite of the significant obstacles.
In the 1870s.
I worked in what was called, or what is called, the neoclassical style: smooth marble, idealized figures, Greco-Roman drapery. But what I did was I chose to fill it with stories of Black freedom, Native survival, and biblical outcast. I want to read something that was touched upon in this small book about me. It's a direct quote from me.
Okay.
I have a strong sympathy for all women who have struggled and suffered. For this reason, the Virgin Mary is very dear to me. I was a devout Catholic, and in my later years, the Catholic Church was one of my most important clients, especially as new classical art began to fade from the scene. Some of my subjects that you should be aware of include Hiawatha. Tell you a little bit more about these art pieces. Haha, and the Arrow Maker. And these were the more celebrated so-called Native American pieces that I made. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow had written a piece based on my people, the Ojibwe. It was called Song of Hiawatha. And again, in those days, there was very little written about my people, indigenous Americans and of course, people of African descent, of colored people, that recognized and celebrated our humanity, the complexities of who we are as human beings, that put us in a positive light. But Henry Wadsworth Longfellow did just that in Song of Hiawatha, which is based loosely on Ojibwe stories. And so I sculpted busts of Hiawatha and of Minnehaha, and then I did a group sculpture called the Arrow Maker that depicted a Native father teaching his daughter to make arrows. I did receive quite a bit of criticism for this work and many of my other art pieces, because although it affirmed Native people as as human beings, period, but with tenderness and skill and familial affection, as opposed to us just being savages who scalped heads, right?
Yeah. Red Indians as well.
I humanized, and what a thing to even consider, that I would have to, in my art, affirm
The humanity of others.
My humanity, essentially. But I was criticized because I still used what would be considered European features, facial features, and the smooth whiteness of neoclassical marble. And so some argued, and I would not disagree with them, that it reinscribed whiteness as aesthetic norm, even as I was trying to honor indigenous identity. Again, pause and think of the time.
True.
Who exactly was going to buy my sculptures?
Going to be
Who
white.
had the resources
Going
to
to be the white
invest
liberal.
in my art? Do you not present whatever it is you are trying to market in a way that will appeal to the sensibilities of the people you are marketing to?
So you will call
And
that a
so
compromise.
I welcome the critique. What I did was, given the times that I was in, used my art to make a statement, but I also incorporated aspects of the art of that time that would provide an audience for my work. Now, there was another piece that I called Forever Free. These are part of my so-called emancipation pieces. It was also titled Morning of Liberty, and it commemorated the abolition of slavery after the Civil War. Now, you all may have heard of or seen the sculpture that was created with Abraham Lincoln as the white savior and a crouching black man
With chains.
with his chains looking up to this white savior. Well, in my sculpture, Forever Free, I have a black man who stands upright, his left arm raised, broken shackles hanging from his wrists, and a ball and chain lay broken beneath his foot. We were not looking to any white savior. We were breaking free of our
chains.
ourselves. But there's another piece to this sculpture. I have a woman kneeling beside him with her hands clasped. His other hand rests protectively on her shoulder. Why is he standing and she is still kneeling? Well, we could speculate, of course, the emancipation of Black people as a whole. But the double bondage of Black women.
Black women, yeah.
And even in that state, Black women still had more work to do to be free. We were still kneeling and passive. Scholars in critiquing this piece of art noticed that the features of the woman were Europeanized. Some read this as me showing the mixed heritage of African Americans, including people like me. Some again read it as a strategic move to soothe racist expectations of white patrons. And of course, some were just downright critical and felt that I was not properly representing our race. In some readings of the sculpture, the chains of the woman are still attached to the base of the sculpture, while the man's chains are broken, but the woman's chains are not. And of course, people are speculating that, again, this is a quiet critique of gender. Black women, Black men having been won in the law, the Black men's freedom having been won in the law, the right to vote, but Black women, as I stated earlier, being doubly bound. Another sculpture that I did was Hagar in the wilderness. I chose this biblical figure, this enslaved Egyptian woman who was cast out with her son, to embody again Black female suffering and yet our resilience. And that had certainly been my life, hadn't it?
True.
Critics again argue that by idealizing Hagar's features and classical style, I was asserting some kind of moral and aesthetic dignity to the figure. I suppose if she looked more whatever we think Black looks like, because do we not have Blackness in every hue and in every facial feature? But some argue that I was asserting a moral and aesthetic dignity of Hagar, which would better plead her case for being cast out, and that I was distancing my work, if you will, from racial otherness. Now, the work that I would say has garnered the most interest, if you will, would have been The Death of Cleopatra. It was my largest and my most ambitious work, and it was featured in the 1876 Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia. It was 3,000 pounds of marble. You have heard the story of Cleopatra, I hope, and if you haven't, then this is a great opportunity to go and study it. But rather than portraying Cleopatra as she's typically portrayed, this beautiful woman who tragically takes her life, I portrayed her. I sculpted Cleopatra, slumped on her throne, head back, body heavy. There was nothing lithe and graceful about it, the asp at her breast, her face slack in the moment of death. And it was a shocking piece of art to most in the world. Critics called it the most remarkable piece of sculpture in the American section of the fair. But many viewers were very shocked by its rawness. Should a white woman be portrayed in this wanton manner? Is this sacrilege? Now, that sculpture needs its own episode of your show, because after the exposition, it was stored, then it was sold, and by the early 20th century, it sat. So we're talking about from 1876, right?
Yeah.
It sat partly damaged at a Chicago a Chicago horse racing track. And later, my 3,000-pound marble sculpture was given the very undignified placement of being the headstone of a dead horse. The racetrack owner had a horse called Cleopatra. And when that horse died, the horse was buried and my sculpture was put on the tomb of a horse as the horse's headstone.
The insult.
And it stayed there for a significant amount of time. And afterwards, that piece of land, the deed of the land indicated that the sculpture was not to be moved. That land became, after it was a racehorse track, it went through so many iterations. It ended up becoming some kind of postal service space. And then finally, the sculpture was moved and was housed in some kind of barn or something. This was after a well-meaning scout troop, noticing some of the damage to the sculpture, had painted it. Art historian Marilyn Richardson finally tracked it down. Because how does a 3,000 pound marble sculpture just disappear?
Yeah. 1,000 pounds.
She tracked it down in 1994 and had it transferred to the Smithsonian American Art Museum, which funded its restoration, and it cost in excess of $50,000 to restore it. Art historians read that piece of sculpture as challenging Victorian norms by showing a powerful woman in an unglamorous moment of self-determined death. Some argue that I was enacting my own fascination with women who refused domination, even at a terrible cost. And of course, there was a whole commentary on race and empire, and a Black indigenous sculptor reimagining an African queen for an American audience obsessed with classical whiteness. And what was my reason for moving to Rome? To just be human. To not have everything about me analyzed from a place of race. But I was almost always the subject or the object. And I did not do autobiographical pieces because I was tired of being the subject. I wanted to just do my art. Other pieces of art that garnered me some attention: in 1877, the President Ulysses S. Grant sat for me in Rome, and I made a bust of his. He was very pleased with it. I sculpted a bust of Charles Sumner for the 1895 Atlanta Cotton States Exposition, linking abolitionist memory to a showcase of New South progress. Created a marble bust of Christ carved in Rome in 1870, and this went missing for decades and was rediscovered in a Scottish church in 2015. And I did a lot of work for churches, Catholic churches in particular, and some of those works are still being found even now. Just a few words, and then I have one final thing I want to share with you. I'm sorry I have spoken for so long. I went to Italy to do something for the race, something that will excite the admiration of the other races of the earth, but I needed room to go and just be an artist. I believe that the good spirits always send me friends, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that. I am grateful for all the people who assisted me, and I've shared some of their names with you already. Charlotte Cushman, who is a celebrated actress, who acted as a hub for women sculptors in Rome and helped connect me with many patrons. Harriet Hosmer and Whitney and other women sculptors, who also helped connect me with this expatriate community. The Shaw family in Boston, Catholic patrons in Europe and later in my career. From about 1896, I lived in Paris. And then by 1901, I had settled in London's Bloomsbury, Holborn area. Don't know if you were, if you know that area.
Central London.
The British census in 1901 listed me as an artist living on my own means, with my birthplace as India. And although I died on September 17, 1907, most of the world was not aware of my death because it was not published beyond a very small circle. And it was again historian Marilyn Richardson who discovered my death certificate and noted that I died in Hammersmith Borough Infirmary in London.
Wow.
And that I died of kidney disease. I am buried in St. Mary's Catholic Cemetery in Kensal Green. I left my estate to one of the priests at the parish. Nonetheless, my grave was neglected and no headstone ever put on my grave until 2017, over 100 years after my death. I believe you have covered other Black women, such as myself, who faced the same fate. In 2017, historian Bobby Reno led a fundraiser to restore my neglected grave and to add a proper marker honoring me as an internationally significant sculptor. I never married. I have no known children. I was briefly engaged in 1873, but I never got married. My will mentioned no relatives. My life was one of great significance, but also of an enduring loneliness. I found great solace in my faith as a Catholic, and I really did actively practice that faith. There are so many books about me. I can't go into all of them, but a cursory search would show some of them, but this is one of them. And that is a picture of me in a portrait that is widely noted. But I wrote something that I would like to share with you at this time as we end our time together, unless you have questions for me. I should note that there was an obituary about me in 2018 titled Overlooked. In 2017, there was a Google Doodle. And in 2022, there was a U.S. Postal Forever stamp in my honor. Oberlin's Edmonia Lewis Center for Women and Transgender People was named for me. And there's the Altoboro Art Museum, MLK Committee's Edmonia Lewis Art Education Scholarship that honor me as a symbol of intersectional liberation. And there have been many exhibitions, including Edmonia Lewis, Set in a Stone, Edmonia Lewis, Indelible Impressions, There are documentaries about me, and like I indicated, many, many books. But this is what I would like to share with you.
Yes.
People have always wondered why I speak of a good spirit. They listen for a proper name, God, Jehovah, the saints of Rome. But I have lived a life too wide, too wounded, too wandering to bind my faith to a single tongue. When I was a small girl and orphan, I walked and worked with my mother's people along the Niagara Trail. The Ojibwe taught me that the world was alive, the trees, the water, the winds, each moved with breath, with intention, with a spirit that listens and answers. They said, a good spirit watches the child who is alone. A good spirit leads her to what she needs. I believed them then, and I believe them still. When I left the forest for the schools of the East, I learned new prayers. I sat in pews made by hands and heard of angels and providence, of a father who watches, of a son who suffers, of a spirit who comforts. Those words were familiar to my heart, though shaped by another nation. But let me tell you plainly, it was not the church at Oberlin that saved me when the world turned cruel. When the mob dragged me into the cold, when lies were tied to my name, when I lay bruised and bloodied in a field, it was not the institution that raised me up. It was the good spirit. Not the white man's charity, not the pity of a system designed to break me, but the ancient, watchful presence that guided me since girlhood. Some say it was luck that sent me John Mercer Langston to defend my name. Some say it was coincidence that brought me patrons, friends, protectors, people who opened doors when others tried to bar them. But I know better. I have always known better. The good spirit walks ahead of me and arranges the path. When I left America, when I crossed the ocean and stepped into Rome, the city of marble and saints, I found yet another language for the sacred, a faith of incense and candles, of carved Madonnas and quiet chapels. I saw my own reflection in those women of stone, suffering yet serene, cast out yet chosen. And so I embraced the Catholic faith, though I carried my mother's teachings beside it. People ask, did the good spirit come from the Ojibwe or from Rome? I say it came from both and from neither. It is the voice that whispered to me when I first touched stone in Boston. It is the strength that steadied my hand as I carved Cleopatra, hour after hour, late into the night, muscles swelling and fatiguing. It is the peace that settled around me when I shaped Hagar, the outcast woman who finds God in the wilderness. It is the spirit that tells me I am more than the world believes, more than race, more than nation, more than woman, more than the names they gave me, wildfire, fire, and such, or the ones they tried to take. I have walked through countries and courts, through insult and applause, through darkness and triumph, and through it all, the good spirit said, stand, carve, live, do something for the race and for yourself. So when you hear me say the good spirit always sends me friends, know that it is not a simple phrase. It is my testimony, my inheritance, my shield, my truth. The good spirit carried me from the forest of my childhood to the marble halls of Rome. And it carries me still. And it will carry me even further as you never forget my name and my suffering and my legacy. Thank you.
Thank you. It will be difficult to forget your name because the cemetery you said, Kensal Green Cemetery, is literally down the road there. It's literally down the road, that cemetery.
Perhaps you will pay me a visit.
Oh my God. The fact that, wow. So, okay. And yeah, when you mentioned Bloomsbury and Holborn, that's the art center in London. So the fact that she passed through there and now she finally rests in Kensal Green Cemetery means, okay, the job still continues of lifting up her name, as it were. And yes, thank you for sharing your story with us. And
May I realize that we have gone beyond the time you usually allot. You started off by saying this will be about an hour. Is the struggle any more different today than it was for me? What can you take from my story? How can you hold on to your dreams? How can you fight when all seems bleak? Can you imagine still a teenager in court against a whole establishment, accused of attempting to murder precious white women. Can you also take the hand of the good spirit and fight today? Those dreams that you are letting languish? If I could, you most definitely can. And mustn't you?
Yes.
For the race, for yourself.
Yes, thank you. Yes, as someone said, I should pay her a visit. I would. Hopefully it's not too cold this weekend. I'll try and go look out for her gravestone. I mean, if I go there, somebody will probably know where it is. Again, thank you, Miss Lewis, for coming through. And we thank our audience for listening and watching. And for those who will also then download the podcast, that should be there sometime tomorrow. And as is customary, we talk about who is coming up next, and that will be Brefu, Queen of St. John. That will be next week. The name again is Brefu, spelled Breffu, Queen of St. John. Again, it promises to be a remarkable episode. Miss Lewis, any final thoughts?
Just gratitude. Thank you for the opportunity to share with you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming through. Again, next week, join us again for Women and Resistance when we look at the life and times of Brefu, the Queen of St. John. Until next week, it's good night and God bless. That is it for this episode of Women and Resistance. Thank you for joining us in amplifying the voices of women who challenged injustice and changed the course of history. Be sure to subscribe, share, and continue the conversation. Together, remember, we honor the past, act in the present, and shape the future. Until next time, stay inspired and stay in resistance.